So, today's offer is final. There will be no more talks on pay. We will not negotiate again on this year's settlements, and no amount of strikes will change our decision.
Well, let's be clear. What the Prime Minister is saying is that he's going to impose another crappy real terms pay cut on public sector workers. The very workers who kept this country going during the pandemic, many of whom risked their lives to keep us safe, and who've already suffered more than a decade of crappy real terms pay cuts. How exactly is another crappy real terms pay cut on top of a whole decade of crappy real terms pay cuts?
A fair deal for workers.
Remember, inflation to May was 8.7%, so the 6 to 7% recommended by the pay review bodies is still just another real terms pay cut. And the position of the Labour Party this morning was even worse. They wouldn't even commit to accepting the pay review body's recommendations.
It's thought the Prime Minister could make a decision on pay rises for 1 million public sector workers as soon as today. Pay review bodies have recommended an increase of around 6%, but Rishi Sunak is worried about how he'll pay for it. What does Labour think?
Well, we'd have to look at that. We're not in government at the moment. We've got our fiscal rules.
Just accept it.
We're not in government, so we can't. We don't know what what those negotiations are going to look like in the future. But the government are not getting around the table and are not negotiating. We've got the strike action in the NHS, and this has been going on for a long time.
So
and it's costing.
Just to be clear, you wouldn't necessarily accept it. You wouldn't necessarily accept the independent pay review body's findings.
We'd have to look at it. That's what we'd do.
So they wouldn't necessarily accept it themselves, Labour?
No, and that's the difficulty, of course.
Seriously? The Labour Party needs to up its game, and if all this isn't bad enough, the Prime Minister is still shamelessly telling the public this.
Look, the most important thing we can do to help people is to control inflation. We've got to reduce inflation. That's what's making life difficult for nurses and for everyone else in the country. And a big part of how we are going to grip and reduce inflation is by having restraint when it comes to pay settlements.
After more than a decade of almost completely unprecedented wage stagnation, workers in the UK are £11,000 a year worse off. 2022 was the worst year for real wage growth in nearly half a century. Average real wages in the UK will actually be lower in 2026 than they were in 2008. So on what planet can it be said wage rises are causing inflation? To use the words of the Prime Minister, that argument is
complete economic illiteracy.
According to the International Monetary Fund, it was rising corporate profits which were the largest contributor to Europe's inflation over the past 2 years, as companies increased prices by more than the spiking cost of imported energy. So just when the Prime Minister should be targeting corporate greed, his shameless government has instead declared war on working people by imposing yet another crappy real terms pay cut on public sector workers. Sunak actually wants us to believe that public sector workers must accept yet another crappy real terms pay cut so the government can bring down inflation. It's an argument that's been completely rubbished over and over again by expert economists. But that hasn't stopped members of the government from shamelessly running about UK news shows repeating it.
So, one of the factors that we have to consider, particularly at a time of high inflation, is if we do inflation matching pay rises, that can actually drive inflation further.
The worst thing that we could do domestically would be to significantly increase public sector pay and then entrench inflation.
It's absolutely shameless. Instead of targeting corporate greed, the government is actually doubling down on its rubbish claim that giving public sector workers anything more than a crappy real terms pay cut will embed and drive high inflation. It's completely insane. How many times do I have to point this out? It's not rocket science. If a private sector company increases its wages, yes, that goes directly into the cost of making that product or service, and that might end up increasing the price. But that's not the case with public sector workers such as healthcare, which are free at the point of use. That means consumers don't pay for them directly, so they don't affect the inflation statistics. The government's refusal to pay our public sector workers what we all know they're worth is just another crappy political choice taken by this government as part of its war on working people. And now it's shamelessly trying to cause division with the public by conning them with a justification it knows has been rubbished over and over again by expert economists. Our public sector workers deserve better than that.